Okay, let's get started. We're doing something a bit different today, looking at two very different times, different places, but finding some, well, maybe surprising connections. And this deep dive, it's really built for you, using the notes and the excerpts you sent over. What you've given us is this really interesting comparison. 16th century Geneva under John Calvin, and then modern Afghanistan under the Taliban. Quite the jump. So our goal here, our mission, if you like, is to really unpack the material you've shared. We want to pull out the key insights about religious rule, especially when it's, well, taken to an extreme. Let's see what patterns pop up, even with 500 years and totally different contexts separating them. So yeah, the first thing the sources make super clear is that massive time gap. We're talking 5 centuries between Calvin and Geneva and the Taliban now. But like straight away, the material you shared makes this really striking point. It says, despite all that time, all that distance, the basic aims, the methods they use, and even some of the results seem, well, remarkably similar.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about the comparison you've laid out here. Because at their heart, both movements really share this vision. It's about creating societies governed like totally by what they say is divine law. It's not just, religion having some influence. It's a complete fusion. Religion and politics all rolled into one, trying to enforce absolute religious moral principles on everybody. And crucially, your sources really underline this. Both Calvin and the Taliban tried or are trying to achieve this by force.
Right. That idea of forcing a specific vision, like a city of God or a purely religious society onto people, that really stood out from the material you provided. Calvin, according to these notes, he saw Geneva exactly like that, a place where civil power, everyday life, it was all directly run based on his reading of divine commands, very focused on making God's will happen on earth as he saw it.
And the material shows the Taliban, calling themselves the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. They're basically attempting something very similar today. They're basing their rule on their specific take on Sharia.
Sharia being the Islamic religious law.
Exactly, yeah. Derived from the Quran, the Prophet's teachings, and so on. And the comparison you've got here shows both movements explicitly wanted or want to impose this framework, this sort of divine legal system controlling every single aspect of life for everyone in the population.
And I suppose controlling life means controlling behavior, doesn't it? Your sources dig into the moral laws, the prohibitions, and it's pretty vivid. The material lists things banned in Calvin's Geneva: dancing, gambling, really any public fun that wasn't seen as sufficiently godly.
And the comparison you shared draws a pretty straight line to the Taliban today. They ban similar stuff, music, certain kinds of jokes, even, flying kites. The key insight here, based on the material, seems to be this shared idea that these kinds of activities are somehow bad for the community. They lead people astray, maybe, or they just clash with the spirit of the religion, whether that's Calvin's Christianity or the Taliban's Islam.
Okay, so how do you actually, make people stick to rules that strict? Your sources talk about enforcement. The material describes how Calvin's system it forced people to accept his version of Christianity. And if you pushed back, the consequences were really severe. We're talking being kicked out, thrown in prison, even executed if you were labeled a heretic or openly disagreed.
And the comparison you've got shows the Taliban taking a path that looks disturbingly similar, using force to make sure their interpretation is the only one. And opponents, or just people who resist, they face consequences that are just as severe, according to your sources.
The actual, structures of control mentioned in your material were fascinating. Calvin set up this group, didn't he, that consisted almost like a moral police force made up of preachers, city leaders, whose job was specifically to watch what people did. And they punish people publicly, right? And could even lead to executions for heresy.
Exactly. And the sources draw a direct parallel there. They compare it to the Taliban's use of the Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi and al-Munkar.
Promotion of virtue and prevention of vice.
Precisely. And it works like a religious police force. Their job is to administer and enforce the Taliban's chosen rules and values. They actively punish rule breakers, often in public view.
So the similarity, it's striking, isn't it? This idea of having a dedicated body to monitor and control people based on religious rules.
Yeah, it really is. And speaking of control and who gets controlled, the role of women, that comes across as a particularly stark comparison in your sources. What did the material highlight there? Well, the sources detail really quite shocking similarities in how women were treated. In Calvin's Geneva, and it's mirrored today in Taliban-run Afghanistan, women were mostly kept in the home. in the domestic sphere. There were incredibly strict moral laws about their behavior, how they dressed, their presence in public, and punishments for breaking rules were severe and often very public, like shaming. The material you provided, it specifically points out restrictions on women's education, their right to work outside the home, what they could wear, their overall freedom of movement, their whole lives, really.
And the justification was religious.
That's what the sources indicate, yes.
Yeah.
Both systems justify these really harsh restrictions based on what they believe God wants women's lives to be. And this approach, as highlighted in your sources, it strongly suggests a view where women are, well, secondary to men within these systems of religious rule.
And all of this really points back to that core issue, the relationship between religion and the state. Your sources note that in Calvin's Geneva, there was basically no separation, almost none. State officials were religious followers, civil laws, power itself. It was all deeply guided by or even held by religious leaders.
And the material shows the Taliban are attempting the same thing, trying to fully weave their religious principles right into the political fabric. Religious leaders holding the ultimate authority. And here's a key point your sources really emphasize. In both cases, disagreeing with the state's principles, which are presented as being God's law, remember, it isn't just seen as political opposition. No, it gets framed as religious disobedience, or even, treason against God himself. And that leads to exceptionally harsh, often violent consequences.
Wow, yeah, that framing makes it almost impossible to have different ideas, doesn't it? Your sources talk about the lack of pluralism in systems like these. When certain ideas are treated as absolutely sacred, it just naturally shuts down intellectual diversity.
It does. And the material you shared gives a pretty stark example from Geneva. Calvin was involved in executing people who just had different theological views, like different ideas about the Trinity.
Just for disagreeing on theology.
That's what the sources indicate, and they connect this directly to the Taliban today, suppressing free speech, cultural diversity, all through force. The comparison really highlights how these systems end up valuing absolute obedience and uniformity way above critical thinking or individual expression.
Given how absolute and controlling these systems sound, it's maybe not surprising your material mentions resistance. It talks about opposition to Calvin back then within Geneva itself. And obviously we see ongoing resistance, internal and external, to the Taliban today.
And this kind of brings us to maybe the broader historical takeaways your sources present. They argue that these patterns, these attempts to impose, rule purely by force, using a strict religious interpretation. They seem to repeat across history. And while they might create these suppressed environments for a while, historically, systems like these have often proven, unstable. They tend to face significant resistance in the long run, often leading to their eventual decline or transformation.
So what did your sources say about the ultimate consequences? What's the end result of trying to rule this way?
The material you've gathered is pretty clear on this. It strongly suggests that using force to impose this kind of absolute religious system doesn't actually bring lasting stability. Kind of paradoxically, it breeds instability. It fundamentally puts the government's own long-term survival at risk.
Interesting. So force backfires eventually.
That seems to be the conclusion from your sources. And they leave us with this quite powerful closing thought. Just like Geneva eventually changed, moved beyond the most extreme parts of Calvin's rule.
Yeah.
Material sort of implies that Afghanistan could potentially find a similar path forward by learning from history. The sources wrap up by really emphasizing that things like diversity, freedom, tolerance, these are ultimately much stronger foundations for a society than just forced uniformity.
Yeah. This whole deep dive, just going through your material, it really drives home how looking at history, even examples that are centuries apart, can show these really powerful recurring patterns in how deeply held beliefs can mix with power and attempts to control whole societies.
Absolutely. And based on everything you've shared with us, here's maybe one last thing for you to chew on. If we accept what these sources suggest, that systems built on crushing diversity and critical thought have historically been unstable and ultimately faced resistance, what does that really tell us about the long-term chances and, maybe more importantly, the human cost of any system anywhere that decides to put forced uniformity above tolerance and basic freedom? Something worth pondering, definitely.